It was just after sunset on a cool September evening when Sarah Mitchell's car was found abandoned at the edge of a quiet country road in Northern Virginia. The driver's door was unlocked. Her purse was still on the passenger seat. But Sarah, a 34-year-old paramedic who had dedicated her life to saving others, was nowhere to be found. For those who knew her, this made no sense. Sarah was careful, responsible, and always in control. Yet that night, she vanished as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Her best friend and co-worker, Megan O'Connor, was the first to notice something was wrong. Sarah had been due at work for the overnight shift but never arrived. At first, Megan assumed she'd run late. But as the minutes turned to hours and Sarah's phone went silent, unease set in. When she didn't respond to messages by midnight, Megan called the police. By dawn, officers were combing through the wooded backroads leading to Sarah's home. The search led them to her silver Honda Civic, parked just off County Route 9, the engine cold, the driver's seat empty. Her uniform jacket hung neatly over the seatback. A faint trace of her favorite vanilla hand lotion still lingered inside the car. To the outside world, Sarah Mitchell had lived a picture-perfect life, respected in her job, admired by her colleagues, and known for her calm, compassionate demeanor. But those close to her knew she had been living in fear. Her marriage to Daniel Mitchell, a retired firefighter, had begun like a storybook romance. They'd met on the job. She was the new paramedic trainee, and he was the confident veteran who took her under his wing. Within a year, they were married. To everyone around them, they looked inseparable. But behind closed doors, things were different. Daniel's easy charm had curdled into control. What started as small comments about her clothes or friends slowly became constant surveillance, checking her phone, tracking her location, showing up unannounced at her station. Sarah had tried to hide it, brushing off concerns with nervous laughter. But the bruises on her arms and the fear in her eyes had not gone unnoticed by her colleagues. In the months before her disappearance, Sarah had confided in Megan that she was planning to leave Daniel for good. She'd already spoken to a lawyer and rented a small apartment under a different name. "I just need to get my things from the house," she'd said quietly one evening after their shift. "Once I'm out, I'm done. No more second chances." That was the last week anyone saw her alive. When investigators questioned Daniel Mitchell the next day, he appeared calm, almost too calm. He told detectives that Sarah had come by the house briefly that evening to grab a few of her things, but left soon after. He claimed he hadn't seen her since. His tone was measured, polite, rehearsed. But within hours, cracks began to show. One of Daniel's co-workers later told police that, months earlier, Daniel had said something chilling over drinks: "If she ever tries to leave me, she won't make it far." Detectives found Sarah's car less than 5 miles from the Mitchells' former home. Tire impressions nearby suggested it had been driven there by someone else and left intentionally. What they didn't find was any sign of a struggle, no fingerprints other than hers, no footprints in the surrounding mud. It was as if someone had meticulously cleaned up after themselves. The discovery of her car marked the start of one of the largest missing person investigations in the county's history. Volunteers, police, and search dogs scoured the forests and streams for weeks. Flyers with Sarah's smiling face were posted on telephone poles and shared across social media. The entire community held its breath, hoping for a miracle. But as days turned into weeks, hope began to fade, and suspicion shifted squarely onto Daniel Mitchell. He stopped cooperating with police. He stopped attending vigils. And when asked why he wasn't helping with the searches, his answer was blunt: "She left. She always said she might. Maybe now she finally did." But detectives didn't buy it. They knew Sarah would never abandon her family, her patients, or her friends without a word. Something terrible had happened, and the truth was buried somewhere between that quiet country road and the home she'd once shared with the man who vowed to love her forever. 2 weeks after Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, the quiet town of Ashbrook, Virginia, was suffocating under a cloud of uncertainty. The local firehouse, where Daniel once served as captain, had become a whispering ground. Everyone had known the couple. Everyone had sensed something wasn't right. But no one had imagined it would come to this. Detective Laura Bennett, a sharp and composed investigator with 15 years on the force, was leading the case. She'd seen her share of domestic disputes, but Sarah's case struck a nerve. Paramedics don't just vanish, she told her team. They run toward chaos, not away from it. Detectives began re-examining the timeline. Phone records showed Sarah's last outgoing call at 7:14 p.m. to Megan O'Connor, a quick voicemail saying, "I'm heading over to the house now. I'll text you when I'm done." That message was never followed by another. By 8:30 p.m., her phone went dark. When police checked surveillance cameras along her route, they spotted her car passing a gas station near the turnoff to the Mitchell property. Daniel's truck was seen on the same road less than 20 minutes later, heading in the same direction. But by 9 p.m., no further footage of either vehicle appeared. Daniel claimed he'd been home watching TV all night. Yet when police examined his phone, they noticed that his location history had been manually disabled, something Daniel insisted must have been a glitch. Detective Bennett ordered a search warrant for Daniel's home. When officers arrived, he stood on the front porch, arms crossed, eyes cold. "You've already looked here," he said flatly. "Not with a warrant," Bennett replied. The team moved quickly. Inside, the house was spotless, unnaturally so. Every surface gleamed. The air smelled sharply of bleach. On the living room table sat a half-finished glass of bourbon, condensation still fresh. But what caught their attention most was the absence: no photos of Sarah, no clothes in the closet, not even a toothbrush in the bathroom. It was as though he had erased her existence. In the garage, officers found a tarp, duct tape, and a set of heavy-duty gloves. Nothing illegal by itself, but unsettling in context. More disturbing was the discovery of a small dark stain in the back of Daniel's truck. Forensic teams swabbed it immediately. When the results came back, Detective Bennett felt the air leave her chest. The stain tested positive for human blood. DNA confirmed it was Sarah's. The news shattered any remaining illusion of coincidence. Daniel's calm demeanor began to crack under questioning. When confronted with the forensic report, he smirked and muttered, "You people have no idea what you're talking about." But word of the discovery spread fast. The community, once divided between believers and doubters, now turned against him. Candlelight vigils became calls for justice. Posters that once read missing began to bear a single word: murdered. Still, the case remained legally fragile. No body. No confession. Only a trail of circumstantial evidence that hinted at horror but didn't yet prove it. Behind the scenes, detectives dug deeper into Daniel's past, and what they found painted a picture of a man whose temper had been building for years. Former co-workers described him as volatile, domineering, and prone to sudden rage. One recalled a chilling incident where Daniel had thrown a chair across the firehouse after losing an argument. Another remembered how he once bragged, "When I get angry, people listen, or they learn." Sarah's friends confirmed what police had begun to suspect: this wasn't the first time Daniel had hurt her. Megan provided photos Sarah had sent her months before: faint bruises on her wrist, a cut near her temple. "She told me he was just stressed," Megan said quietly. "But I knew it was worse than that." As the pieces came together, a grim narrative began to form, one of escalating control, isolation, and fear. 3 days later, a neighbor came forward with a crucial tip. The night Sarah disappeared, he'd seen Daniel's truck leaving his driveway around 9:30 p.m., with its headlights off. The vehicle returned nearly 2 hours later. When the neighbor asked about it the next morning, Daniel simply said he'd gone for a drive to clear his head. Armed with this testimony, detectives secured a second warrant, this time to seize Daniel's truck in its entirety. Forensics conducted a deeper analysis, finding small traces of blood soaked into the fibers beneath the rubber bed liner. In the crevices, they discovered strands of long blonde hair, a match to Sarah's. The evidence was damning. But Daniel still refused to speak. That changed one evening when detectives received an anonymous call from a man who claimed Daniel had said something he shouldn't have. When officers located the caller, a former co-worker named Greg Walters, he admitted Daniel had been drinking heavily at a local bar 2 nights after Sarah vanished. During their conversation, Daniel had leaned in close and said, "She thought she could outsmart me. Nobody's ever gonna find her now." That statement, careless, drunken, and cruel, became the turning point of the investigation. A week later, Daniel Mitchell was arrested for the murder of his wife. He didn't resist. He didn't ask for a lawyer right away. He just smiled grimly and said, "You won't find anything. You can't prove a thing." Detective Bennett stared at him across the interrogation table and replied, "Maybe not yet. But time has a way of uncovering everything." The news of Daniel Mitchell's arrest spread through Ashbrook like wildfire. For a small town that prided itself on community and order, the headline felt unreal: "Former fire captain charged in wife's disappearance." At the fire station where Daniel had once been hailed as a hero, his framed commendations were quietly taken down. Former colleagues stood in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the man they'd known, the one who'd charged into burning buildings, with the monster now sitting behind bars. For Sarah's family, the arrest brought both relief and heartbreak. Her mother, Linda Carter, stood outside the courthouse as reporters crowded around her. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear: "I don't want revenge. I just want to bring my daughter home." Detective Laura Bennett knew those words all too well. Without a body, every case walked a razor's edge between justice and uncertainty. And Daniel Mitchell was cunning. Even in custody, he refused to crack, answering every question with smirks, half-truths, and cryptic remarks that led nowhere. In one early interrogation, Bennett leaned forward across the metal table. "Where is she, Daniel?" He looked her straight in the eye. "You think I'd tell you if I knew? She left. She couldn't handle me anymore, that's all." But Bennett wasn't fooled. She could read the flicker of pride behind his calm exterior. He wasn't just denying, he was enjoying her frustration. Over the next few weeks, detectives scoured every corner of Daniel's life. Search teams expanded the radius around his property, diving into nearby rivers and combing through dense woodland. Nothing. Then, a new lead emerged. Forensic technicians analyzing Daniel's phone found deleted messages sent the night of Sarah's disappearance. With advanced data recovery, they pieced together fragments of a conversation he'd tried to erase. At 7:03 p.m., just minutes before Sarah's last known phone call, Daniel had texted her, "Come alone. I'll let you take what you need. We can talk." The tone was disarmingly calm, almost polite. But for detectives, it was proof of intent. He had lured her there. Another discovery deepened their suspicions. GPS data from Daniel's truck revealed a route he hadn't mentioned, a detour through an isolated area known as Pine Hollow, a stretch of forest notorious for its steep ravines and abandoned mining pits. The coordinates were logged between 9:42 and 10:18 p.m., exactly the time frame his neighbor saw his truck leave and return. When search teams descended on Pine Hollow, they found remnants of disturbed soil, faint traces of ash, and melted plastic consistent with burned debris. Though the evidence wasn't enough to confirm a body had been there, it was clear something had been destroyed. Meanwhile, prosecutors built their case brick by brick. Without a body, they leaned heavily on the mountain of circumstantial proof: the blood in his truck, the recovered texts, the eyewitness accounts, and his own chilling boasts. By the time Daniel stood before a judge for his arraignment, the courtroom was packed. Cameras flashed as he was led in wearing a plain orange jumpsuit. His face, once familiar from community fundraisers and firehouse parades, was now etched with bitterness. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge asked, "how do you plead?" Daniel looked up, his jaw tight. "Not guilty." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Linda Carter gripped her husband's hand, fighting back tears. To her, every word out of Daniel's mouth was an insult to her daughter's memory. As the weeks passed, new cracks began to form in his story. Fellow inmates reported hearing him brag about taking care of business. One claimed Daniel had said, "They'll never find her. I made sure of it." Though jailhouse testimony was always taken cautiously, it aligned with what investigators already suspected. Daniel took pride in his control, even from behind bars. Detective Bennett met with prosecutors to discuss the next steps. She knew they were walking into dangerous legal territory. Convicting someone without a body was notoriously difficult, and Daniel's defense attorney, a shrewd, media-savvy lawyer named Martin Graves, was already preparing to paint Sarah as unstable, suggesting she'd run off voluntarily. Graves wasted no time launching that narrative publicly. "My client's wife had emotional problems," he told reporters. "She wanted to start over. This is a case of an innocent man being punished for a woman's personal choice." The statement enraged both investigators and the public. Megan O'Connor, unable to stay silent, gave her own interview days later. "Sarah was scared," she said firmly. "She told me if anything ever happened to her, it would be because of him." That single quote lit up every headline. Under pressure, the prosecution pushed forward. By early winter, Daniel Mitchell was formally indicted for first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. As he was led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, reporters shouted questions. Daniel turned briefly toward the cameras and said, almost proudly, "You can't convict a man without proof." Detective Bennett watched the footage from her office that night, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes. She knew he was daring them, confident that without a body, he'd walk free. But she also knew something else about men like Daniel Mitchell. They always believed they'd covered every trace. They always thought they were smarter than everyone else. And that arrogance, Bennett was certain, would be his undoing. Winter settled over Ashbrook, cold and sharp, as the case of Commonwealth versus Daniel Mitchell began. Snow fell on the courthouse steps the morning jury selection started, a quiet, eerie contrast to the storm brewing inside. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Former colleagues, curious townspeople, and reporters from across the state packed the benches. The story of the missing paramedic and her controlling husband had become a symbol, not just of loss, but of every silent victim who'd been too afraid to leave. Detective Laura Bennett sat beside the prosecution team. She'd worked hundreds of cases, but this one felt personal. For her, it wasn't just about proving guilt, it was about giving Sarah back her voice. The prosecution's lead attorney, Claire Holden, began her opening statement with calm precision. Sarah Mitchell was a woman who helped others for a living, but she couldn't save herself from the man who promised to love her. Holden walked the jury through the evidence, the deleted text messages, the blood in Daniel's truck, the witness who saw him leave his house that night, and the chilling words he'd later spoken in the bar. Each fact alone was a spark. Together, they painted fire. The defense, led by Martin Graves, countered with his trademark confidence. "There is no body. No weapon. No confession," he told the jury. "We're here because the police couldn't solve a disappearance, so they created a villain instead." His argument was simple, and dangerous. Without a body, he said, there was no proof Sarah was even dead. Maybe she'd fled. Maybe she'd wanted a new life. "You can't convict a man based on assumptions," Graves insisted, turning to the jury with theatrical sincerity. Daniel sat beside him, silent but alert. Dressed in a navy suit and tie, he appeared calm, the picture of a wronged man. Occasionally, he would glance toward the gallery, his eyes finding Linda Carter. Each time, she lowered her gaze, unwilling to give him the satisfaction. The trial unfolded like a psychological duel. Megan O'Connor took the stand first. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she described her last conversation with Sarah, the fear, the quiet plan to leave, and the unspoken dread that Daniel might not let her go. "She told me she'd go to the house, grab her things, and call me right after," Megan said, blinking back tears. "She never called." Holden showed the jury Sarah's final voicemail, her voice calm but cautious. "I'll text you when I'm done." The timestamp, 7:14 p.m., echoed like a heartbeat through the silent courtroom. Next came the forensic experts. They explained how traces of Sarah's blood had been found beneath the bed liner of Daniel's truck, impossible to see with the naked eye but irrefutable under testing. Photos of the truck appeared on the screen, and the jurors leaned forward, uneasy. Then came the digital evidence, the deleted messages retrieved from Daniel's phone. One juror audibly gasped when the final text appeared on the projector, "Come alone. We can talk." The prosecution rested after 10 days, their case built not on a body, but on a web of facts too precise to ignore. When it was the defense's turn, Martin Graves launched his counterattack. He portrayed Sarah as impulsive, unhappy, and possibly suicidal. He even suggested she had staged her own disappearance. "Isn't it possible," he said dramatically, "that Mrs. Mitchell chose to disappear, and that Daniel is guilty only of being the husband she left behind?" The theory was paper-thin, but Graves delivered it with conviction. He called character witnesses, old colleagues who remembered Daniel as brave, loyal, and protective. Under cross-examination, however, those same witnesses began to unravel his narrative. One recalled Daniel's short temper. Another admitted he'd once thrown a radio across the room during an argument. Still, Graves had one final card to play: Daniel himself. When he took the stand, the courtroom went silent. He spoke softly, his voice controlled, occasionally breaking into feigned emotion. "Sarah was the best thing that ever happened to me," he said, eyes glistening. "I didn't hurt her. She left, and I've been paying for that every day since." For a moment, it almost worked. Even some jurors seemed uncertain. But then came Claire Holden's cross-examination. "Mr. Mitchell," she began evenly, "how do you explain your wife's blood in your truck?" Daniel's jaw tensed. "She cut her hand once. Months before." Holden took a step closer. "Then why did you try to clean it with bleach?" He hesitated. "Because I keep my truck clean." She didn't flinch. "And when you told your coworker, 'No one will ever find her,' what did you mean?" Daniel shifted in his seat, his practiced calm slipping for the first time. "I was angry. I didn't mean it like that." Holden let the silence stretch. "You meant it exactly like that, didn't you?" For the first time in the trial, Daniel looked cornered, eyes darting, breath shallow. His attorney quickly objected, but the damage was done. Over the following days, the jury watched and listened, to friends, experts, and evidence that, piece by piece, stripped away Daniel's mask. When closing arguments began, Claire Holden's voice carried through the room like a verdict waiting to be spoken. He controlled her in life. He tried to erase her in death. But the truth still speaks, through the blood he couldn't hide, the words he couldn't delete, and the fear she confided before she vanished. By the time the jury retired to deliberate, the snow outside had turned to freezing rain. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. For 3 long days, the town waited. When the jury finally returned, the room fell silent. The foreperson stood, holding the slip of paper that would decide everything. On the charge of first-degree murder, the foreperson said, voice steady, "We find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Linda Carter buried her face in her hands. Megan wept openly. Daniel Mitchell didn't move. His expression hardened into something cold and hollow. He simply turned toward the jury and whispered, almost to himself, "You still won't find her." It was a chilling promise, and one Detective Bennett would never forget. The verdict was hailed as a triumph of justice. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs and relieved embraces as the judge pronounced Daniel Mitchell guilty of first-degree murder. Yet amid the tears and the clatter of reporters rushing for quotes, a strange emptiness hung in the air. For Sarah Mitchell's family, victory felt incomplete. There was still no grave to visit, no certainty about where she'd spent her final moments. Linda Carter, her eyes swollen from days of crying, whispered as she left the courthouse, "Justice doesn't feel like justice when your child is still out there somewhere." Daniel Mitchell sat stone-faced as the judge handed down his sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion, no flicker of remorse. Only once did he speak, turning briefly toward Detective Laura Bennett as officers prepared to escort him out. "You think you've won," he said quietly. "But she's still mine." The words chilled her. In the weeks that followed, the community tried to move forward. The vigils that once filled the town square with candlelight became memorial services. Churches held sermons about resilience and the danger of silence in abusive relationships. Neighbors left flowers near the spot where Sarah's car had been found, a lonely roadside shrine where people stopped to pray or leave handwritten notes that read things like "You mattered and we remember you." Detective Bennett, though proud of the conviction, couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, a final piece that refused to surface. She'd seen killers like Daniel before, men who couldn't stand to lose control, who viewed their victims not as people, but possessions. And they rarely left loose ends without a reason. Every night, Bennett reread the case file, every map, every text, every lead that had once seemed like a dead end. Pine Hollow lingered in her mind. The burned debris, the soil samples, the melted fragments, it had always bothered her how inconclusive it had been. Winter faded into spring, and the forest thawed. With the approval of the prosecutor's office, Bennett requested one final search of Pine Hollow. This time, cadaver dogs joined the team. It felt like a long shot, but she couldn't rest until every inch of that place had been examined. 3 days into the search, one of the dogs alerted near a cluster of fallen trees, several hundred yards from the original dig site. The handler called Bennett over. Beneath the layers of earth, the search team uncovered fragments of bone, small, pale, and weathered by time. The dig expanded carefully, the air heavy with dread. Piece by piece, the remains began to emerge, a partial skeleton, a torn scrap of dark fabric, and a rusted necklace chain. When Bennett saw the charm still attached, a tiny silver heart engraved with the letter S, her chest tightened. Sarah had worn it every day. The news broke that evening, skeletal remains believed to be Sarah Mitchell found in wooded area. DNA confirmation came within a week. The remains were hers. The discovery reignited the public's grief, and sealed Daniel Mitchell's fate beyond doubt. Forensic analysts determined the bones showed signs of blunt force trauma, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. Nearby, they found traces of burned plastic consistent with the tarp taken from Daniel's garage. When Bennett informed Daniel of the discovery, he showed the first true reaction she'd ever seen, a flicker of something between fury and disbelief. "You found her," he muttered, shaking his head. "You weren't supposed to." Bennett met his gaze steadily. "We always do." With the remains recovered, prosecutors filed additional motions to formally reaffirm his conviction. Though it didn't change his sentence, it erased any doubt that lingered in the public's mind. Sarah's funeral took place on a warm May morning, nearly 3 years after she'd vanished. Hundreds gathered, paramedics, police, friends, and strangers, to pay their respects. Her casket, draped in white lilies, was carried by her former co-workers from the ambulance unit. As the service began, the sound of sirens echoed briefly in tribute, a final farewell from the people she'd once served beside. Megan O'Connor delivered a short eulogy through trembling lips. "She saved lives every day, even while she was losing her own. Sarah's story isn't just a tragedy, it's a warning. If someone you love is hurting, speak up. Don't wait. Don't think it'll get better on its own. Because silence can be deadly." When the service ended, Sarah's mother placed a single white rose atop the casket and whispered, "You can rest now, sweetheart." For Detective Bennett, standing at the edge of the crowd, the moment brought quiet relief. Yet it was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but too late to save the woman who had begged for peace. That evening, as dusk settled over the cemetery, Bennett stood by the grave one last time. She thought of the first night Sarah's car was found, the unanswered questions, the fear, the uncertainty, and how it had all led here. The truth had finally surfaced, just as she'd promised. But in its wake, it left behind a silence that no verdict could ever fill. And though Daniel Mitchell would spend the rest of his life behind bars, the shadow of his cruelty lingered, not in his words, not even in his crimes, but in the lives he'd forever changed. In the months that followed Sarah Mitchell's funeral, Ashbrook began to heal, though the scars of her story ran deep. The roadside where her car had once been found was transformed into a small memorial garden. A wooden bench stood beneath a maple tree, with a brass plaque that read, "In memory of Sarah Mitchell, a life that served others." Fresh flowers appeared there every week, often left by people who had never met her but felt as though they had. Detective Laura Bennett visited often. She'd sit quietly on that bench, watching the breeze move through the trees, remembering the months of searching, the nights spent chasing ghosts through evidence files, and the chilling stare of Daniel Mitchell as he'd told her she'd never find her. He'd been wrong. Daniel now sat in Redwater State Penitentiary, a lifer with no visitors and no parole. According to prison staff, he rarely spoke. The once proud firefighter who had strutted through the courthouse now kept to himself, eating alone, writing in a small notebook no one had seen. Some said he spent his days pacing, whispering to himself. Others claimed he still believed Sarah belonged to him, that she'd never really left. But Sarah's legacy had already escaped his grasp. Her family, with the help of Megan O'Connor and Detective Bennett, started a foundation called Sarah's Promise. Its mission was simple yet profound, to raise awareness about the warning signs of domestic abuse, especially within relationships that appear strong from the outside. They hosted workshops for first responders, teaching them not just how to handle victims, but how to recognize when one of their own might be in danger. Megan became one of the organization's most powerful voices. In her talks, she never sensationalized the story. She spoke softly, with emotion but without anger. Sarah was brave, she often said. But bravery isn't always enough. We have to see the signs before it's too late. The foundation's work began drawing attention beyond Ashbrook. Local schools invited Megan to speak, police departments requested training materials. Each time she told Sarah's story, it reached someone new, a mother, a daughter, a friend, who might have been suffering in silence. For Linda Carter, healing came slowly. The grief never fully faded, but it transformed into purpose. She began volunteering at a women's shelter in Richmond, sitting with survivors late at night when fear kept them from sleeping. She would hold their hands and whisper, "You're safe now. You're not alone." Years passed, and the story of Sarah Mitchell became more than a tragedy, it became a lesson. Her photo still hung in the Ashbrook Emergency Services building, framed above a plaque that read, "In honor of courage, on duty and at home." Detective Bennett eventually retired from the force, but Sarah's case remained etched in her mind as one of those that defined her career. Every time she spoke to new investigators, she mentioned Sarah, how the smallest details had led to truth, how persistence had brought justice, and how silence could destroy lives faster than violence itself. One autumn afternoon, Bennett returned to Pine Hollow. The trees were beginning to turn, their leaves a mosaic of gold and red. She walked the narrow trail to the clearing where Sarah's remains had been found. The site was peaceful now, sunlight filtering through the branches, the faint sound of wind in the grass. It was hard to imagine that once, this place had held such darkness. Bennett knelt, brushed her hand across the earth, and whispered, "We found you. We kept our promise." As she stood, she noticed something small glinting near the base of a fallen tree, a shard of glass, maybe from the night of the crime, long buried and recently unearthed by rain. She picked it up, held it for a moment, then let it fall back into the soil. Some things, she knew, belonged to the past. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the memorial bench by the roadside caught the last of the light. Its brass plaque shimmered faintly, the engraved words glowing in gold. Sarah's story had ended in violence, but what endured was not fear, it was strength. Through every life her story touched, she continued to speak, through the women who found courage to leave, through the officers who learned to see danger where once they hadn't, through the quiet persistence of people who refused to forget. In the end, Sarah Mitchell's name became synonymous not with tragedy, but with survival. And though the man who silenced her would spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell, her voice, carried by those she left behind, would never be silenced again. She saved lives, Megan once said, her voice steady before an audience of first responders. Even after she was gone, she saved mine.